again, Introduction to U.S. Cyber Policy is something I teach at the undergrad and grad level and do a full semester. It's tough to get into a semester, right, to get oriented, and we're gonna do this all in 90 minutes, right, is what I was explaining. So this is a lot, right? We're gonna like fly over briefly and touch on some things. That being said, I'm hoping, and there's obviously a wide range of previous interests and expertise in this area in the room also, I'm hoping that there's a little something for everybody, right? So for those of you who are working at CISA or in the field in other ways, I'm hoping maybe I can offer a little bit of a framework, right, to zoom out, right, and see things from a more macro perspective, from a policy perspective. For those of you who are just new to it, who like me are in denial for a few years and kind of get your toes in the water, I'm hoping that I will start from the beginning, right? Like what is cybersecurity, and what does it matter, right? So again, just to try and level set in the room, I'll ask for the patience of those of you who are a little more familiar, and we'll kind of roll through. As time allows, we can go deep into a couple topics. I want to leave plenty of time for conversation. And please interrupt me. I don't want to talk for 90 minutes, right? It's horrible for me and for you. But welcome. It is awesome to have you here. I can only hope next week when my classes kick off that my undergrads and grads are as energized as this room. Sometimes not so much, at least in the beginning, but it's wonderful to have you guys here. I'm so excited to hear about all the reasons you are. So let's see if we can get the technology to work. So 2 seconds on me, so you know who you're dealing with. Okay, so I have one daughter. She's 15. She's into TikTok. It's horrible. I don't understand it. I have to do it. She sends me TikToks. I make TikToks with her. It's traumatizing. Okay, so my husband's an architect, actually, and also much more technologically savvy than I am. So both of them are more technologically savvy than I am, and I always tell all my students, you don't have to be technical to be in cyber policy, right? Cyber policy is everything and it's everywhere, so don't be afraid of it, right? That's the place to start, and I'm the classic case of that because, like some others in the room mentioned, I've got to talk to my 15-year-old, right, about some basic stuff all the time. There's a lot of animals in our life. Luna, Katie, and Casey the horse. Casey's pretty busy. On the professional side, I did grow up at the FBI, so I got my master's here a few years ago. I'm not going to tell you what year I did. I came into the government through the Presidential Management Fellowship Program, which many of you are probably familiar with, and that's how I had the incredible opportunity to join the FBI Counterterrorism Program back in 1998. So I just had an incredible experience at the Bureau. Again, a different time, a different conversation to talk about that progression. I actually was in the Boston office on 9/11. I worked for about 6 months there, and then I left for a time and did some work, my first stint in academia. So I spent some time at Northeastern University running a grant-funded project and a number of other really fun things, and had a baby, stuff like that. Just kept myself out of trouble. In 2007, I was offered the opportunity to come back to the FBI, and I did. My background is in public administration, right? I did my master's here, as I mentioned, in public administration. So I came back to the FBI to do strategy, performance management, and all those kinds of things. Again, another conversation for another time for those who are interested, but an incredible way to come back into the organization. And from there, I got to then work in a number of programs because I was kind of a process person. And it sounds like a number of you are in a similar situation where you're kind of process people and then get to work in different substantive areas across your career. So that's where I first got exposed to cyber. So I guess it was about 2009. A guy named Sean Henry, you may have heard of, who now runs CrowdStrike, one of the large companies who deal with data security issues, was our executive assistant director over the criminal cyber response and services branch. And I got to go work for him on his staff, and in that capacity, we got to work with Director Mueller, trying to figure out how to structure the FBI to address cyber. And let me start by saying, when I said cyber, certainly back then, and until pretty recently at the FBI, I meant computer intrusions, right? We were concerned about computer intrusions with the FBI. I wasn't thinking about things like disinformation and lawful access and all these other things we'll talk about. So that was my first exposure. And again, you'll see it's really informed how I think about cyber, right? How should the government be organized, right? Starting from me and my world at the FBI and expanding beyond to address this growing threat. So fast forward from there, got to do really cool stuff in the criminal division. Another important stop in my career that informs the way I think about cyber is back in 2014, Director Cohen decided, the FBI had always had 3 externally facing offices. You guys are all familiar with this, right? A congressional affairs office, a public affairs office, and a law enforcement outreach Director Mueller had started and Director Cohen finished standing up 2 new offices, both relevant to the conversation today. One for private sector outreach, right? And some of you work in those offices today that was new to the FBI. And the other was a White House coordination, a National Security Council facing White House coordination office. And I was asked at the time to stand up and lead that White House coordination office. And that's when cyber got real for me, right? That's when it became what I worried about when I woke up in the morning and when I went to bed at night. The White House was working on a number of related issues, including things we'll talk about like coordination for incident response, what became PPD 41 for those of you familiar, and things like lawful access, which we'll talk about today, but you're all probably familiar with the Apple iPhone case, San Bernardino, right? These questions about how law enforcement can proceed when with court authority, they're still unable to get access to data because of the way it's structured, right, on the platforms or in a container. So I say all this and I spend a minute talking about this because I'm not a technical person, right? I'm a process person. I'm a person who is fascinated by interagency coordination. During this time, while I was in these roles, I came back to AU and I got my PhD in public administration because I needed a project on the side before. No, because I'm crazy. Actually, the real story is because when I came back to work at the FBI, there was a hiring freeze. Some of you may be familiar with these situations, right? There was something called hollow work years. Anyway, we moved back to DC and I didn't have a job. So I applied to come back and do the PhD here. And the way the world works, on the same week, I got into the PhD program here and I got my job at the FBI. So I had a crazy boss who said do them both. I did. Again, started for over a glass of wine. I left the FBI in 2016 as the Chief Policy Advisor for Science and Technology. I tell all my students, this is what can happen in the federal government. I do not have a technical background in either science or technology, but I was the Director's Chief Policy Advisor for Science and Technology because I understood the structures and how to think about some of these core policy issues, right? So this, I spend a moment talking about because it really informs how I approach this issue and kind of the piece and the models I want to share with you today. Makes sense? I left, as I said, in December of 2016, I joined what was then PwC, which is now Guidehouse, been in management consulting for a couple of years. I then took a full-time position here at AU as of this summer. I've been an adjunct here for quite some time, and I now direct the master's program in terrorism and homeland security policy, and as I mentioned, teach US cyber policy. Okay, speed round, that's that. Any questions to start? Kind of sense? Okay. I'm gonna try my best not to rush, but it's gonna be hard. Okay, so there are folks in the room really familiar, kind of, what is cyber, what is the internet, all these things, but again, I just want to take a minute and level set for folks in the room who are not, okay? So we're gonna just take a second and start at the beginning. With my classes, both grad and undergrad, we do the same thing. We spend the whole first third of the semester talking about what is cybersecurity, and why does it matter. We spend the second third of the class talking about who's who in the policy conversation and what's the playing field. And then the last part of the class of the semester, we run case examples, right? We dig into kind of how these things play out. I'm gonna go through this pretty quickly. If you're interested, this is the book we use in class. I have it on very good authority with some very senior people in government who got big jobs, read this book before they started, okay? Who came with no cyber background. Really recommend it. It's a little bit dated, it's a couple years old, it's free online, but this is like, so it's cybersecurity and cyber warfare, it's Singer and Friedman, okay? Highly, highly, highly recommend, just to kind of get your mind around the basics. I'm gonna give you the 5 minutes, but read the book if you want more, okay? What's the title? What's that? What's the title of the book? So the title is Cybersecurity and Cyber Warfare. And it's Singer and Friedman, P.W. Singer and Alan Friedman. And again, I believe it's a Brookings publication, so it's free online. And the book costs like 15 bucks. Yeah, you bet. That's the other thing you'll see at the end. This whole field is evolving all the time, right? It's so complicated, it's nearly impossible to keep your arms around it. So offering resources, and you'll see at the end I have some websites I recommend of places to go to kind of check in and get reliable information is something I'm hoping to pass along today as well. Okay. So what is cyber? Cyber is the realm of computer networks and the users behind them, right, in which information is stored, shared, and communicated. cyber is the internet, right? By and large. And let me just start by saying one of the things I find really interesting. We have a woman here. She's our acting dean of communications at the School of Communications. She's amazing. Her name is Laura Denardis. She's also a very, very well-established engineer and internet governance scholar. And one of the things she talks about that I think is so interesting is that when we use the word cyber, right, people who work in security use the word cyber, and people who work in kind of economics and IT use the word the internet, right? It's all the same thing, folks, right? I'm here to tell you, like, it's all one ecosystem. And these are some of the basics or kind of fundamentals that I think make it so much easier to understand what's going on. Okay, cyber, what is cyber, right? All right, well, let's start by talking about the internet. So where did it come from? Again, I'm neither internet historian nor expert, but it's good to get some perspective, right? The internet comes from academia, right? It comes from academics who were working on ways to share large amounts of data with each other and work on it collaboratively, okay? And what year, right? We're talking about 1969. Why does this matter? Was the internet created for commerce? No. Was the internet created for TikTok? I don't even know what TikTok's for. But was it created for TikTok? Right? No. What was it?
To annoy parents.
Yeah, to annoy parents. It wasn't even, the internet was not even created to annoy parents, right? The internet was created so academics could share large quantities of data and find ways to work on it together. It's important to take a step back and remember that, right? Because today when we're like, oh, why isn't it clear? Why isn't there good governance, all this stuff? This is sort of it's an animal, it's a beast, right? That's been created for very different purposes, but it's being used now. And in a lot of ways, we're trying to catch up, right? And kind of get a grip on it. It sort of give a sense here of the progression. I always put in Ray Tomlinson at BBNN, who created and picked the @ sign, because I went to high school with his daughter, and I like to give him a little shout out whenever I talk about the creation of the internet. Email, 1972, right? So that's the year I was born, right? That's the year email was born. But important to get some perspective on what we're talking about here. In the 80s, again, this is sort of a high-level generalization, but in the 80s is when this starts to kind of expand beyond the research community. I won't ask everyone's age in this room, but when I went to college, right, you had to go down to the basement to the computer lab. Okay, young people in the room, don't laugh at me, right? You had to go down to the basement and there was dial-up, right? And then you could maybe do an email, right? Or print or something like that. And I had a computer in my dorm room only because my stepdad built it for me, right? Out of like pieces and parts, okay? But just important to remember what we're dealing with. This is new, right? When I was at the FBI, in my job, externally facing and dealing with companies, one of the things I found really frustrating is that the companies, the large companies, were not structured to interact with the government. And I don't know, maybe some of you have found this as well, right? It's getting better, and it's been accelerated under the Trump administration for a lot of reasons. But when I was working these issues, they weren't even structured. They didn't know who to plug me into, right, as companies. And someone said to me, keep in mind, Sasha, right, the FBI has been around 100+ years, and they just created this office that you're running externally facing. Google's been around for 10 years, right? It's easy to forget because of the world we live in, but this is all really new. One of the things I do with my students on the first day is make them do an exercise where they start with waking up in the morning, end with going to bed at night, and have to write down all the ways their life touches the internet during the day, right? And the list gets longer every semester, right? And it's crazy when you really start to think about it. And I'm not even worried about IoT in my refrigerator, right? I mean, I'm really not. But all the pieces and parts, right? And that progression since, say, the 80s is remarkably fast, okay? So just to put a touch on that, I'm not going to brief or explain how the internet works because I don't truly understand the technology, okay? But I understand a lot of qualities of how it works, and there's a few important ones that I want to talk about. So first of all, and really important for cybersecurity, is that the entire system is based on trust, right? There are these interplays of sharing of information that are dependent on trusted relationships, okay? So from a policy perspective, it's super important to keep that in mind. We'll talk about this in the next slide, but that trust can either be broken accidentally, right, or on purpose. And so let's pause here to ask you guys, I always ask my students at the beginning, so when something goes wrong on your phone, or something goes wrong on your computer, or your car, which is really a computer now, what is your first instinct? Do you think, I've been hacked, Or do you think, ugh, like, snafu, must restart? What do you think?
I want to smash it.
You want to smash it. Because you're just thinking there's like a snafu, there's like a bug. Is there anyone in the room who's like, something goes wrong, you're like, this is it, I'm going down, my identity's been stolen. Does anyone have that instinct? I have that instinct, okay? Does anyone else share that instinct? Yes, you do? Is it because do you think of the work you do? Is it because it, yeah, exactly. So I think it's the same, right? If you work in the field, right, and you see everything that's going on, my husband always say to me, like, why would it be you? And I think what you learn when you work in the field is, why not, right? It could be anyone. And one of the things we had Sean Kerwin come in and guest lecture last semester, and he spends a lot of time with CEOs and boards, right? Trying to get them to be concerned, right? And alert about what's going on, and obviously buy their products and services. And so one of my students asked a great question. They said, how do you get them, how do you convince the CEOs to care, right? To work and to have some of that instinct. And what Sean said was not, I brief them like on Iran and North Korea and Russia, right? He said, I make the point at how random, right, it can be for people to be victims, right? You don't have to be the owner of sensitive information. You don't have to have, you don't have to be OPM, right, and have all the personally identifiable information for all federal employees to be a victim of an attack. There are lots of reasons you could be, and one of the really important things to understand is it can be random, right? You can get caught up in something else very easily. So anyway, I'm not saying this that everyone should think they've been hacked when something goes wrong with their computer. I'm just saying it can be either. It can be either or, and it's worth considering both when something happens. Okay, a big question that I love to think about and tackle, and I love to challenge my students with is, who runs the internet? Who owns it, right? This thing that we've just, in another context, have gone through and shown how much it touches our day-to-day lives. Like, who's in charge? What do you guys think? Who's in charge? Like, there's a problem with my internet. Who do I call?
The bad guy.
Not Verizon. Okay, don't call Verizon. You're already good.
China.
Call China if you got a problem. Good. Okay.
I call my daughter.
You're good. The kids maybe should provide some technical assistance. But in real life, right? Again, and I try and if we had a full class, we do a big exercise, right, to really make this impression of how dependent we are on this. And like it's not really a clear answer, right? Because there is no owner of the internet, right? And that's what we'll start to talk about today when we talk about governance. Who's making those decisions, right? A whole confluence of actors. Right? A huge confluence of actors are making those decisions that are guiding this infrastructure that we are now entirely dependent on, right? And that's the part of it that I'm super interested in, right? Not the technical aspects of the internet, because frankly, I'll never understand, right? I've watched every YouTube video about how digital currency works. I still don't know. Like I try, okay? But what I can get my mind around, and I challenge you to get your mind around, because a lot of folks in town don't think about even, let alone understand, is who's making the decisions that govern this? What is the nature of those decisions and what impact might they have, right? And those of you who work at CISA live in this world every day. But as I said in the beginning of class, cyber touches every person and is the responsibility of every department and agency, right, across the government. Okay, a couple key qualities before we go on. It's important to remember this thing we call the internet, that as Laura Denardi says, will keep going if all the people disappeared tomorrow, right? It will keep going. She gives this great example. Like, your mortgage payment will be paid by your bank if you disappeared, right? It will continue to happen until electricity runs out, right? It was made by people, right? And to a certain extent, it's managed and certainly governed by people. And we tend to think that it's this thing, this cloud, this other whatever, but there's a huge human aspect here that we have to keep front and center if we're going to understand kind of what's going on. It is a physical thing, right? Where does the internet live? Is it like a cloud? Is it like in the brain? Like, what is the internet made of physically?
A lot of cables.
Yeah, so there's cables, there's servers, right? There is a physical component to the internet, right? There's a thing called the cloud, right? The cloud is also a thing, right? It's not something ethereal, right? It is made up of people and it's made up of machines. There is a virtual aspect to it, there are sovereignty aspects, and again, I spend multiple class periods on this with my students. There's nationality issues, property issues, there's both top-down and bottom-up governance issues, users and gatekeepers. It's evolving, there's cables, and there's content, right? And again, I say all of this quickly just to say, particularly for those of you new to it, it's hard to get your But what's up with cybersecurity, right? Why does this become a problem? We talked about this a little bit already, but a great kind of clear the underbrush answer from this book comes when the difference between the expected behavior and the actual behavior is caused by an adversary, right? By an adversary, as opposed to a simple error or accident. The malfunction is called a security problem. Okay? Seems simple when you see it here, but it is meaningful and helpful. Again, to think about, there can be all kinds of cyber issues, right? And there are lots of them. But the question for cybersecurity is when there's a nefarious act, right? A bad actor who is trying to do things. And in class, we talk about the categories of things they can do and all this stuff we don't have time to do today. But it is important to just remember, like, it's a true security problem from a policy perspective when you have an adversary, right, driving that behavior. Okay? That's our level set. We spend about a month and a half in class. We spend about 30 minutes here. That's fair. Okay. Yes?
Does that definition then, do they need to be have ill intent towards you, or can it be something that they've done that you didn't realize there would be interaction that would have negative consequences?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I would argue the latter, right? As I mentioned already, sometimes if I'm having an effort to do an adversarial act to you, but you're connected to the people all around you, right? There's going to be, there's nefarious intent you get caught up in, right? So it doesn't have to be particularly designed to you, but it has to be designed for a nefarious act in some way. Does that make sense? And now some would argue, there's arguments on all these things, right? The nice thing about cyber is nothing is settled, so there's no right answer. So everything's to discuss. Some people think of like a computer bug that does not have nefarious intent as a security problem, right? It is a security problem. If there's a bug in your iPhone that's going to cause your data to be leaked, even if there's no nefarious intent by an adversary, right? But from a policy perspective, right? We're thinking about cybersecurity when there's an adversary who's after us for some kind of nefarious intent. Make sense? Okay. Okay. So what does this look like today, right? Like, what kind of cybersecurity policy issues, policy 101 here, are we grappling with today? So what I want to do is very quickly touch on this kind of word cloud of things that are flying around, see if anyone has any they want to add, and then what we want to do is take a step back and talk through how are we going about even trying to address these, right? None of these have a simple answer. I tell my students, like, we're going to tee it up, you guys are going to fix it, right? Because there's no answer today. I can certainly argue positions on a number of these. There's no answers. It's important to have this context of the universe of stuff flying around, and then to start to think about how these things are getting sorted out and debated in town and who the players are or should be, okay? So real quickly, actually, let me ask you, what up there is like stuck in your craw? Which of these things you see up there, you're like, yes, that is our priority cyber policy issue. Who wants to say something about one of the things up here?
The disinformation.
Why is it bugging you? It's bugging me.
Well, it's one of the reasons it bugs me because information gets thrown out there and people just take it for the gospel. They say, oh, this is true. I read about it. I saw it on the internet. And it's a lot of confusion. And it's mind-boggling that people will believe anything they're reading these days.
100%. So disinformation is not new, right? And we spend a whole, this is one of the things we deep dive in my class. It's been used in a number of contexts or a number of ways, but it's new in terms of its spread on social media, right? And it's spread through cyber. One of the things we talk about in class, and we watch a little video on, it's not only the problem that I communicate to you some form of disinformation when it comes in all different forms, right? But it's also that it creates doubt, right, in all other information, right? And that's very scary, right? We don't know what to believe anymore, right? If we have very senior, hypothetically, government officials sending out of context pictures and videos and saying it's one thing when it's another, hypothetically, like, then what do we trust, right? Like, then what do we trust, right? And so I always emphasize to my students when we talk about disinformation, which is center, right? Again, there's two problems. There's the me to you, right? Like bad information. And then there's the kind of spoiling the well, right, of all information. And now we're raising a generation who doesn't trust, I don't know, government officials, the Washington Post, sort of things that I certainly grew up thinking, like, this is the end all be all. Okay, we could talk about disinformation for the next 60 minutes. Does anyone else, a couple other ones? Yes?
Hi, critical information, infrastructure protection.
Yeah.
That I I wrote a paper some long time ago about how do we protect our electricity system, our gas, our water. I mean, it's mind-boggling to think about it.
Yeah.
How do we protect these critical infrastructures to our United States?
Absolutely.
You know?
And I think a couple of you said you work in this area, right? This is humongous and challenging, and one of the great areas to kind of run the question of who are the players, right? And if we're gonna create security paradigms, who even needs to be at the table, right? To get that figured out, whether it's energy, water, right? Any of these critical infrastructures we're talking about, absolutely. One or two others, who else? Yes?
Internet of Things.
Yes.
Become ubiquitous.
Yes.
And it opens up all kinds of vulnerabilities to get no idea what they are.
What's your favorite example of IoT that's mind-boggling?
Just controls and lights.
In the classroom? I said it earlier in the class, the refrigerator, right? And there was a story someone was recently telling me, which is like, well, who cares if the Russians know that I'm out of asparagus, right? Like, who cares, right? Well, those things have microphones too, right? That can be remotely taken over. There's a story, again, Laura Denardis talks about in her book, about, I relate to this, I have a teenage daughter who they grounded their teenage daughter, took away her phone, and she used a refrigerator to communicate with her friend. Right? I mean, leave it to the kids to figure it out, but like, if the 15-year-old can figure it out, right? But, or some of our adversaries can too. One other example on that is, Laura, again, I just went to her book talk, she just released a new book, everyone should read, we talk about that too. But internet's in the body, right? Skin sensors, in your heart, your pacemaker, right? IoT is like actually getting in, the internet's actually getting connected to the human body. Yeah.
And it's sort of a similar issue, but that can end up being, or the internet can end up being the weak link where even if you have a very secure system, very secure computer, if somebody gets in through your refrigerator,
exactly.
then they're in the network and you get to your computer that way.
Yeah.
So there's a whole chain of causality there too to be aware of.
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah.
The issue that I face, Lisa, it becomes a pressure point from Congress is the lawful access.
Let's talk about it. It's my favorite.
gas is a whole, we are looking over the last, 10, 15 years expanding partnerships and collaboration in a very academic sense. However, then we get the pushbacks, like things have, we'll just say, changed over the last 20 years in our relationship with the Russians. And then we have a big issue with, well, what does North Korea's know and what do the Chinese know? And we get prohibitions about we can't work with them, we can't do this. And then people who are foreign nationals, what kind of access they're allowed to have. And so there's certain things that the barriers up to try to be secure, but then does that, hinder what we're trying to do in advancing our technology?
Incredible. So you just said a whole bunch of things, right? That I want to unpack and talk about for the next 90 minutes. Again, there's too many things, but so many things come to mind with what you just said. So let's just pull apart a couple of them. First of all, right, we partner with the Russians, or we're Russians rather, around space, right? And what does that look like in a technical way around sharing access to systems, right? And all these things. Incredible questions. I hear what you say too on the government side, it's very relevant on the commercial side, supply chain, right? Where does our stuff come from that goes into other stuff, right? And especially things that are internet enabled, right? And in the research community, if you're sharing stuff, right, with other countries, right? Or for us commercially, where does Apple get those pieces and parts for your iPhone, right? Where does the government buy their computers from? Okay, big question, and let's talk about procurement, because that's my pet peeve too. Like, where is the government bringing their stuff in from, right? Absolutely, there's so many interesting pieces and parts there. The adjacent part around lawful access, just because every opportunity I love to talk about it, is the very specific technical question in addition, right? Is that when you have a national security or criminal investigation, and you have court authorization to get digital evidence from something, right? But like the iPhone in the San Bernardino case, and there's actually an iPhone related to a very current counterterrorism case as well, there's physical visibility because of the way encryption is formulated to get in, right? There is no capacity to do that. And that's a huge challenge. And just like you said, we've got to balance, right, our desire for scientific progress with these risks around partnership. We have got to balance, right, that privacy security piece that we all very much want in this universe, this complicated universe, with our ability to keep a law enforcement apparatus, right, national security apparatus that can get data they need, right, when the court has agreed they do, right? All of these balancing pieces is what makes cyber so exciting. Okay, one more. Anything else up there? Yeah?
Election regulation?
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So hard. Okay, talk to me about elections.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, you have
board, each of them, right, have sort of sub-stories and all these complexities. What I argue, right, and that's what I focus my research on and my teaching on, is that the first way to start breaking some of these things down is to start figuring out who are the stakeholders, right? Who's got a role to play in these pieces, and then we can move through what's the technology, what are the implications, and what are the options, right? But what I find in this town, and I hope this is helpful to you guys maybe when you sit in some of these conversations, that people jump right to solutions, right? Like, I got it figured out, right? Elections, we need X. And we'll talk about we'll hopefully end class with a little discussion about, like, one of the current things now is, like, we need one cyber agency. We need a new cybersecurity agency. And I know my sister friends will love this one. So, okay, you skipped like 100 steps. And I'm like, what are you talking about, right? It's the same with lawful access, election regulation, disinformation, offensive operations, right? Super interesting. VEP, for those of you not familiar, so this is the vulnerabilities equities process run by the White House, slightly updated now, which is, go with me on this for a second. So departments and agencies, right, in the course of their business may discover, right, bugs or other sort of zero-day sort of entry points, right, and other things in the software, things like an iPhone or other things, for national security purposes. Sometimes they like to hang on to that information, right, and use it for national security purposes. That is the process at the White House, simply stated, where they're required to report that up through the apparatus and go through a balancing exercise and say, okay, but should you report that to Microsoft? Or is it okay for the government to hang on to that information and use it in an accountable way for a little while for national security purposes? Complicated, right? Like, extraordinarily complicated. But a real life thing that's happening right now that I feel like we need to talk about, right? Let's see, IoT we talked about, incident response. For those of you who work in this field, certainly from an FBI perspective, there's a significant breach at Target, at Sony, right? Something huge happens. And the question is, how does the government respond? How does CISA interact with the cyber division at the FBI, with potentially U.S. Secret Service, HSI, all these pieces and parts we'll start to talk about. What does that kind of setup look like? And how is that reported up to the White House and to the Hill? There is PPD 41, an executive order that outlines some of that, which is relatively new. That's only 3 years old now. So these are all things that are in development. And one of the reasons this is so fun, right, is because there's no clear-cut answers, and because things are flying around in very much real time. But all of this is the universe of stuff we're talking about. Okay, anything you think that's top of mind that I left off with my word cloud? Yeah?
How about cyber forensics?
Yes, so tell me more. I'm gonna write things down because I will add them later.
It's just, as you just mentioned, you get an incident, how do you go about tracing?
Yes.
Where things happen, you don't touch anything until, if someone hacks the system, you don't shut it down, because then you're shutting down your environment.
Yep.
So you have to go and trace back, okay, where did it come from, what's the connection, are there any backdoors?
Yep. Yeah, and so there's so many issues, again, I think from an IT perspective about, I always take it from like kind of an enforcement perspective, but from an in-house IT perspective about all the standards, what is reasonableness, right, on the front end, and then what's sort of appropriate response on the back end, and all of those things being worked out, sort of what is reasonable to expect from a government agency or from a company, right? What are folks liable for, not liable for, cyber insurance, right? There's a whole universe of questions.
Like unlocking, the incident where Apple didn't want to unlock a phone.
Yeah. It's my favorite example. If anyone wants to stay after and talk about San Bernardino, I'll stay here all day. Okay, yeah.
I think the other interesting thing, and especially under a policy umbrella, is just you set the parameters going in, right? All this change is extremely quick. Policy is never quick. So policy, in this area, policy is going to tend to lag because it evolves and changes because there's so much innovation in it, which always makes it a challenge.
Exactly. Always changing, always innovating. So again, how do we even begin, thank you for my tee up for my next slide, how do we even begin to get our mind around this thing, right? And again, my hypothesis, now that I'm an academic, I get to talk this way, my hypothesis is, again, the place to start is kind of mapping who's who in the zoo, right? And so let's run through that briefly. Okay, this is my really fancy graphic, okay? So fancy. I sketched this on the board because, again, through the semester, and then we'll talk about examples in each of these buckets. So, we talked about cyber and the internet, it's all the same thing, right? Whether you're concerned because you're a company and you're worried about your supply chain, or whether you're concerned because you're on the cyber division of the FBI and you're worried about national security actors and intrusions, right? You're dealing with the same set of complications in the same ecosystem, right? That affects all of those things. And the question that we spend the semester talking about in my classes is, again, who makes all those decisions that come together to drive that? And what are the levers we can pull to solve some of the problems we talked about in the last slide? So step one is to get kind of a sense, get a grip of who's at the table. So the first point here, and we'll do examples afterwards, but is the private sector, right? Who owns 90% of data that moves around in this day and age? Right? Private sector, right? Who owns like most of the cables and computers and servers that drive the internet? Sector, right? Who owns all the big platforms that our 15-year-old daughter spends her day on? And some of us too, right? LinkedIn, Facebook, Google, right? Like private sector, right? And this right now is a primarily unregulated space. Full stop, right? That's it. It is essentially an unregulated space owned by the private sector, okay? So why does the private sector matter for the government? Because they own the infrastructure, right? And they know what's going on before we, the government, do, okay? So any discussion of any of these issues without consideration of private sector partners, you got a problem. And we'll go through kind of what it looks like, but starting to break down that ecosystem and understand who's who in that zoo is a lifelong pursuit. That changes all the time, but something worth investigating, okay? Any thoughts on that before we move on? Anyone skeptical of my characterization of how big that box is? No? Okay. The next sections over here is what I like to call the overt policy process and the covert policy process, okay? So the overt policy process are things that you all are familiar with, right? What's going on the Hill, what's going on in the executive branch, and what's going on in the courts. I always challenge my students, right? We say executive branch, they say FBI, I say what else, right? And this is where we get to all the departments and agencies you guys are from, right? All are relevant. This is where we get to the National Security Council and the White House cyber strategy, right? You gotta unpack, thank you. You gotta peel that orange, right? Back deeper, and we'll do some of that to understand what's going on. Same with Congress, not much happening, but that's another story. And a lot of stuff, we talked about lawful access, gets litigated in the courts right now, right? In the absence of policy to guide things. Okay, our covert policy process. Can anyone give me the basics, like what is internet governance, who are these standards bodies, what might I be talking about here? Anybody know? Yeah?
Maybe the FTC.
FTC? A regulatory agency? Yep, I probably put them, like right here. Kind of right here, okay? Because they're definitely here, right? And they're engaged here, 100%. Anybody know, what are some non-governmental agencies or organizations that run this?
I think there was ICANN in the earlier slide. There's
Yep.
people that do things like decide whether .com or .net or .whatever will work for an internet address, for example.
Yep, exactly. So, and we'll go into some of the details, right? I just want you to see the big picture for now, but there are whole multinational organizations that are making design decisions because of that need for trust and collaboration we talked about from the internet to work every single day, okay? That end up driving all of the issues on the previous slide. And I will tell you, like, most people in government, and I shouldn't say most, because if you work at NIST, or you work maybe the FTC, you know, right? But if you work the FBI, I don't want to speak for CISA, but like, my folks at the FBI, even today, don't really understand what's going on, but they're living with the consequences of those decisions every day, tackling that policy issues up here, right, which we need to do, but this is where a lot of these things start, right? Right now there's debate around new standards around encryption happening here, okay? And I can speak from my old organization, we're gonna wait till it gets up there to talk about law enforcement implications, right? But it's happening down here now. And a whole list of organizations we'll talk about in this crazy underworld of multi-stakeholder discussion in meetings where people snap to vote. Seriously, people like snap like this to vote, okay? Seriously, I'm not joking. Okay, so, but who understands this? And to quote my colleague, Laura Denardis from here at AU, design is policy, right? The way you design this stuff, the way you connect this stuff, the nitty gritty underground of how this stuff's put together is what then creates later on what we see as kind of public policy challenges. Does that make sense? And a lot of that starts down here, all right? So we'll talk more about that. Okay, what's going on with the states? I'm gonna close. So, again, we're taking a US view on all this, but here in the states, what's going on with state policy and cyber?
Elections are run by the states.
Yep, elections are run by the states, so they own responsibility for sorting a lot of that out, absolutely. Any current, what's that?
Utilities are
Yeah,
regulated by the
regulated by the state,
state.
absolutely. Are there any state laws you guys are familiar with that are addressing some of the issues we talked about in the previous slide? Anything new, anything coming up?
I don't necessarily, but the states have their own consumer privacy protection laws.
Absolutely, which these guys hate.
Yes.
Right? They hate it, right? This is where we have some leverage over the companies, right? Because if it's a patchwork of data privacy, data breach notification, right to your own data, there's a big California law that just came down. If it becomes a patchwork, these guys have got problems, right? Because they need, their stuff is borderless, right? So the states have an incredibly strong role to play, and like in all policy areas, healthcare and otherwise, it's often an incubator, right? States are trying things to the point that was made earlier. It's so hard at the federal level to get policy going that it's often at the state level that things are tried, kind of tested, and then get picked up at the federal level. Okay, so we gotta think about the states. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to ask, so when we talk of states, are we also talking about like states, tribes, and U.S. territories, or states?
That's a great question. I gotta add a subcategory. I gotta check it out. I don't know if those guys have done policy work. And I would love to talk to you if you have some examples, so we can add it in. Adding complexity to this model is my favorite thing. Because that's my whole point, is how complicated it is. So it's a great question. I haven't thought of it. I'm gonna do a little work. We'll talk about it after. Perfect. So yeah, yes, ma'am.
Another aspect with the states is each state has a separate and different policy.
Exactly.
And so when it transfers over into the different branches, the governmental branches, they have to try to figure out, I just know it's going to deal with the grants.
Yeah,
They try to
exactly.
figure out, okay, how does this one transfer over to this one?
Absolutely.
And merge, find something in the middle that can satisfy everybody's need.
100%. And this is a challenge of our federal structure, right? Which is a wonderful challenge that balances things. It's particularly challenging in cyber that's so borderless, right? It's challenging in education that it's different in states, it's challenging in healthcare, all those things. But I would proffer that it's particularly challenging here because cyber is so borderless that it gets very challenging. Okay, so we're taking a very US-centric approach to this, okay? And let me just tell you now, like, we're not ahead on this, right? Where there's nothing about us that's particularly ahead on this compared to some countries, not all. There's a huge international dimension to this, right? Around international norms, international participation in internet governance. The Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans all participate collaboratively with us on internet governance, right? So we are remiss to not talk about this all in the context of things like GDPR and other decisions that are going on around the world. But for me, I'm US focused. I really would like us to be able to get our arms around our piece of this and then think about how we interplay. It is interesting to me, the State Department, I think someone's here from the state, has a program we're now sending folks over. I know one of the women who's going from MITRE, she's wonderful and so smart, she's going overseas to help think about cyber governance in some developing countries. And I was like, that's great. Like, are you exporting the US model? Like, what's the US model, right? And so it's interesting to think about us advising others, and clearly in places we're extremely sophisticated, but I would offer that as a whole, we don't entirely have it all figured out, right? And how this governance piece should come together, what the right balance is between each of these components, yeah? So I wanna dig into each of these, and then we'll talk about a couple more issues. Let's see what we're doing on time. All right, we got 30 minutes. Any questions on that? Okay, so what's going on in each of these areas? Let's talk about a couple things. Okay, who's who in the zoo in the private sector? So we've got the big ones, right? The huge ones that drive our daily lives. Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Apple, right? it's just incredible, right? The strength and the breadth that they have. And then the decisions they make. I think Facebook just announced they're not going to make any kind of discerning regulatory decisions or limitations around political ads, right? This affects all of us, for better or for worse, right? I'm not offering who should make those decisions, but it is interesting that that decision is being made at Facebook, right? There's also Twitter, some other small companies like Twitter and Microsoft, right? Who affect our lives, who are ingrained in our lives, and the decisions they make, again, about running political ads or what kind of hate speech they're going to take off their platform, right, has an impact on all of us. And again, my point for my students, and the point I emphasize here, and you all being kind of a government crowd understand and appreciate this is entirely decisions being made in the private sector. Again, just to touch on lawful access for a second, because it's my favorite topic. When people argue that to structure systems so that law enforcement could have access with a court order is unsafe, right, would be unsafe, and would destroy security in a way that's unacceptable, I argue that we live in a world where companies do that every day, right? So many of us use Gmail every day, right? And the reason you get served ads that relate to the content of your email is because Google's reading your emails, right? And the only way they can read your emails is if they have an access point on the back end. The exact kind of structure that law enforcement is suggesting in the context of an iPhone, okay? There are many other examples as well. When you do online banking, right, and many of us do, and finally have given in, right, I tried not to, but I did. There are regulatory agencies that must regulate the banking industry and must have access to those transactions. Thus, those systems are set up in a way that they are documented and accessible on the back end. And that's about our banking and our Gmail, right? We do electronic healthcare records the same way. Most of us have laptops from our organization that have enterprise access points on the back end. So my point about the lawful access debate is not, is it technically feasible to create a system that's reasonably secure and has an access point? My question is, who's deciding when we do that and when we don't? And right now, that's entirely in the hands of the private sector, right? The private sector makes those decisions. And that's interesting, right? That's interesting in this country that that's kind of where we are. And something I like to just make sure everyone's aware of, right? If we're good with that, I'm good with that. But if we're not good with that, like, these are the folks we got to work with and talk about regulating. There's folks who actually own the components of the internet. Akamai, AT&T, Verizon, right? Folks who are providers of the service. Folks who are very involved in that internet governance conversation. And folks who maybe aren't in the headlines all the time about this stuff. But if they're not at the table, right, it's tough to have productive conversations. And there's little guys. There's an organization called, it used to be called the App Association, it's now called ACT. They represent small app developers and kind of their perspective on all this stuff. And again, innovation is not bad, right? We want innovation, we want convenience, we want all these things moving forward. And so are we going to start regulating, because we're thinking about a Google and what's going to happen to the young woman who's creating an app in a basement, right? Who's now, like, to do this, she has to have a lawyer and a security team and all this stuff. We want to make sure that we're balancing those things. So the private sector is not just those big guys, right? And it's not just Akamai and AT&T and Verizon and those guys on the infrastructure. It's all of those innovators, right, who are creating these cool apps that are improving our lives, right? Questions on that? Thoughts on the private sector? How comfortable are you all? Is this kind of new to you, or do you think about this as question one? Like, a lot of these things are controlled by the private sector. Is it new, and or how comfortable is the room with kind of how much is in their hands right now? Who's going to talk to me? Let me go. Yes.
So, from what I can
Yeah.
From what I hear right now, so it's dangerous to do banking online then.
Okay, that was not the takeaway I was going to, so let's go back through this. My point about online banking was this. I bank online. I use electronic healthcare records. I use Gmail. About a lot of personal stuff, right? If you had my Gmail from going way back. All of those systems have the ability for a regulator or law enforcement with appropriate oversight to come in through an access point. I will not use the word backdoor because I think that is ridiculously loaded. come in through an enterprise-controlled access point and access that information, right? And I am comfortable that that's safe enough. I know it's not perfect, and that's why when things go wrong, I'm like, oh, maybe I was hacked, right? Like, I live in the real world. We use systems every day that use encryption. All those systems are encrypted, but the encryption is implemented in a way that there's a set of keys, right, that a third party, usually the company, keeps. So if someone comes and needs it for lawful reasons, they can get in. Now, some people don't feel comfortable with that. Some people live their life on WhatsApp, which is also not perfectly safe.
Exactly.
But this is the point, right? It's like security is a relative concept, right? So the question is, what's safe enough? And what I say to my students who are like, okay, like I can't use my iPhone and like I can't online bank. I have to say the other thing, like I say use it all, but I live, and maybe it's because I grew up in the FBI, I live with the expectation that everything could also get out. And
Could get out? It
will get out, right?
If you work in the
Will
government,
get out?
Well, it
It's out.
depends, right?
You mean
What
it's
is-
already
in the web?
Well, okay, let's back it up. So, I know that the Chinese have all my information,
Yes.
the OPM have, right? Everyone in the room, probably,
Yeah.
unless
What
they're right.
happened?
So, that's it, right? But I also know, having worked with the FBI, like, using that data for any useful reason is challenging, right? So, how worried am I in my life about the fact that the Chinese have had all my stuff for a number of years? Like, not happy, right? So the question is also, what does out mean? You're absolutely right. Like, listen, the companies have all your stuff. They own all your stuff, okay? It's out, right? Exactly to your point. So the Chinese have all their stuff from the OPM app. Google has all my stuff, right, from my Gmail, right? The question is, what is out? Out to me is my emails from my Gmail being taken out of context and put in the Washington Post, right, as a former FBI employee. That to me, right, which is a human element on top of that, that's out, right? Or something about my daughter or something like that. You're absolutely right. And that's actually my point. Like, we need to understand that our stuff that traverses the internet, right, is owned by other people and already out. You're right.
We've gone too far though. That's the problem.
Say more.
Because we've chased the reward. Everything that we're talking about is driven by commerce, financial.
Not anymore.
The risk that we've lost sight of the risks and the vulnerabilities. So until you're exposed to it, or until you're a victim of it, you want all the luxuries, you know, how many people in this room have Alexa or whatever the other, so we're all being monitored. I could go get a warrant and follow anybody's phone and figure out where you've been if I have probable cause. And what's that mean? I could write probable cause all day long.
Okay, hold on. I have to stop you there. There's a couple things here, okay? Let's break it down. Like, first of all, to your first point, I am 1,000% agreement with you, okay? It is all about profit, right? And any of these companies, including Apple, would tell you it's about anything else, right? It's just, well, it's fun, okay? This is about money and profit. Again, how they make those decisions, right? Apple, it's a secure container. We absolutely cannot compromise. Okay, everyone in America owns a phone. The next market's China. They want us to compromise. Okay. True story. Okay, right? It is entirely about money. So I 100% agree with you on that. I take issue with this idea that you can get a warrant and anything's probable cause and you can survey anyone. In this
That was a little bit of an example.
Okay, good. I just think that you know what I'm saying, right? So I would agree. It is about profit and our stuff is out there. But to the point of, thus I should not do online banking, right? I think online banking is relatively secure. But this gets back to the point from the beginning of class. When something goes wrong on my laptop, I think, oh boy. And the first thing I do is check my bank account. The next thing I do is I check the draft and sent box. Here's a little tip I learned from my FBI guys of my Gmail, right? Because if someone's sending stuff out on your behalf, it's either going back and forth. You can see it in your sent box, or sometimes they're using the draft folder to do that, right? So the second something goes wrong, I check those drafts, right? But I online bank, I do online healthcare, but I also live in a world where I use my credit monitoring, right? I know the Chinese have my social security number, right? I just live in that world. So my point back to to lawful access in the phone is though, exactly your point. We are willing for 5% off for groceries, right? To use that little SKU, right? And let them track all our stuff. Do I give my Amazon account at Whole Foods? I do not. Because there are some limits, okay, to what I want Amazon to know about my life, and that I buy these weird RX bars, because I like them, okay? And it's like my little protest, right? Amazon knows everything about us. Google knows everything about us. The Chinese know all of us, right, in this room through the OPM Act. That is true. That is true. So we live and make decisions with that knowledge, and we make choices about convenience. I also use Waze, right? Waze knows where I go every single day, where I live, where I work, and how I get there. But for me, it saves me so much time that I make that trade-off. I do, I make the trade-off, but I make it knowingly, right? And that's the world we need to live in. Yes.
I mean, how many people have location history on their phone for
Yep.
Google Maps?
Exactly. Apple knows everything about where you are, where you live, where you go. Yes.
Yeah, so I think ultimately it comes down to, you added a couple slides too, is that the system is built on trust. Like,
Yeah.
the reason why we feel comfortable doing this is, well, why some people feel comfortable with this is that they have that level of trust with the corporations or with the government that they're gonna use the data for what they say they are going to, or that, you know, they're gonna try their best to keep that under control. So for some people, that's a trade-off that they now people into risk, but that's up to the trust that you have set up right now.
And we could definitely spend our remainder of this class talking this. I want to touch a few other things, but I will challenge you to think about it, and I challenge my students to think about it. By and large, Americans today trust companies, these companies, more than they trust the government.
Yep.
More than they trust everyone in this room. They do, right? So the companies say, trust us with your data, and most Americans do. And then the government says, I have a court order. Okay, let's just talk about Asheville and San Bernardino real quick, right? It was owned by the county gave consent. And there's court order. So they didn't need a court order, but they got a court order. They had consent from the owner of the phone, right? And they had a court order. And people are still like, hold on. We don't want the government in that phone, right? It's interesting, right? But again, sitting now where I do in academia, to like take a step back and think about these things. That's what's driving all these policy conversations. And that's why we have to start to unpack who's involved. Because otherwise it's a theoretical conversation about disinformation or lawful access or election security. Let's get to it, right? Like, who owns the stuff? Where are the decisions being made? And what's being balanced, right? Now we can start to accelerate some productive conversation. Let me go through a couple more. I would love to talk about all these things. We have 15 minutes. Okay. Okay, so just one quick thing I want to highlight, just may be of interest. So I won't go through sort of specific legislative stuff that's working its way through now. It's going so slowly, it hardly matters. So let's talk about something else. The Cyberspace Solarium Commission, okay? This is a bipartisan, bicameral, right? So we've got Senator King and Representative Gallagher who created this commission to look at a lot of these issues. Now, one of the things that concerns me about this is the breadth they're taking on. It is fabulous, right, that we have this going on. It's going on right now. They originally said they're going to do their work in about 6 months. They're like, oh, we might need a little more time to solve all the cyber issues of the U.S. government, right? But I went up and I spoke at a cyber kind of industry day at FBI Boston. And before I started this, I said to folks, there was about 100 people in the industry. I was like, who's heard of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission? One person in the room, okay? Hopefully more of you have heard about this. There's an open email box for these guys for suggestions, right? They're holding hearings, they're running symposiums. This is a huge effort. Again, in this kind of environment, a really rare one to do in a bipartisan, bicameral way. And all of this is kind of churning through. It's broken down into task forces real quickly. There's this whole question around what the DoD strategy should be. So we haven't really talked about this in the context of this class, but there's an idea about kind of defending the country, and cyber means, they use the phrase defending forward, okay? And so what does that look like? How do we be more offensive, aggressive, forward-leaning to defend in the cyberspace? They're gonna work all that out and get back to us by this time. Task Force 2, and again, these have reps from a lot of departments and agencies working on them. Domestic cybersecurity issues. So a lot of the stuff we talked about already today. How do we work better with the private sector, right? That's a whole interesting area unto itself. How do we educate on cyber hygiene for every single citizen in the country? What does that look like? Those are all topics that the Cyberspace Solarium Commission are taking on. The last Task Force 3 is cyber norms and non-military instruments of state power to shape adversarial behavior in cyberspace. This is an entire other area about what do we do? And you've seen the government try different things, right? Is it sanctions? Is it indictments of folks that will never get to come to this country, right? What do we do with other countries who are doing adversarial action against us? And outside of sort of traditional ways, are there other means to respond, okay? So I say all this kind of with 15 minutes to go. I just want you to be aware if you're interested. This is all coming. Again, there's conversations, not open hearings, but closed hearings happening now. There's an email inbox if you have suggestions. If you work in congressional affairs, again, may be of interest. And all this stuff should be coming out. They have, they're looking to send out the recommendations in the spring. It may get pushed again. They've taken on a lot. They're also taking on encryption and the question of whether we should have one cybersecurity agency. But getting it all figured out. Okay. What's happening at the White House? Well, there's a lot of things happening at the White House. But what's happening at the White House in cyber policy? So a couple things that are important for those of you unfamiliar with this kind of ecosystem inside. So inside the National Security Council, there has been, for some time now, a cyber directorate, right? Within the National Security Council, made up of detailees from a number of different departments and agencies working cyber policy there. And it's a whole other class, a whole interesting passion of mine about how those decisions get facilitated and the meeting structure, but that's all happening. A couple important organizational things to know. We used to have a cyber czar. Michael Daniel was the cyber czar under the Obama administration. That position's been eliminated. Okay, so we'll just leave that hanging. Maybe we'll get back to that. So we don't have a cyber czar at the White House at this time. The Trump administration has been trying to make the NSC smaller and more efficient. So actually, the cyber directorate is actually getting smaller, not bigger as we speak. The good news here is that the Trump administration has a pretty comprehensive White House cyber strategy. Came out, I think it's 2017. And you see here, again, some of the areas they're working. So the folks who do remain in the NSC are driving to these pillars. And some of you, certainly those of you at CISA, are aware that this is a very real effort, right? So there's a list of things that the White House thinks should be happening in cybersecurity. And that staff is literally holding conference calls with relevant departments and agencies, kind of stuff I'm sure you guys work every day, holding kind of accountable for performance measures in each of these areas. What's interesting to me is this strategy came out, and then a few months later, the Cyberspace Solarium Commission decided they would start from scratch with their own strategy, right? So we have a White House strategy, and we have a significant effort on the Hill to build a strategy to go forward. How those two things kind of come together or don't, again, interesting. We're gonna keep going, but questions on any of this? Are any of you involved in this process?
I will be.
You will be. All right. I'd love to hear all of how it's going. Yeah. So I know our FBI rep up there who's wonderful, and they're really doing some great work out of the White House, I think, in terms of coordination across the departments and agencies. It's a huge lift. Huge lift. Yep, I'm good. Thank you very much. Okay, has anyone seen this before? Nobody? Okay, yes. One.
Yep.
All right, deep in the recesses of your federal experience. Okay.
Hey, you got some TV on there.
Yeah, exactly.
Throwback.
It's a throwback. Okay, so if you Google, like, how's the U.S. government organized, again, we're still in the executive branch, how's the executive branch organized, you might see reference to something called the bubble chart. The bubble chart was contemporaneous with my work in cyber, so probably 2010, maybe a little off, 2011. This was a hard fought, hard negotiated, as you guys can imagine who work in this space, graphic, okay? That explained, there's so many things to say about this and what's missing and what's there, but at least how DoD, DHS, and DOJ, FBI, again, when CISA was NPP, how they shared or coordinated across the space, okay? So much to say about all this. First of all, it's just a story unto itself about why it's so hard to come to this kind of agreement, and that this has never been updated, right? Because anyone's too scared to reopen this conversation, right? And they can't figure that out, right? But again, trying to understand cyber policy, wouldn't it be nice if we had a map, right? Shouldn't someone have a map? This is the best we have. You know, there's so many things missing here. Where's the private sector, right? Where's NASA and FAA and Commerce and NIST, right? So many things missing. And we'll touch on this if we have time at the end. But this is what scares me about the proposal to create a cybersecurity agency, is that this is who folks have in mind to pull into that. And it leaves off the table so many resources and assets of the federal government all of you all, right, in your departments and agencies who need to be involved in the fight if we're gonna be effective. So bubble chart, it's a whole other conversation, a whole class, but it's an oldie but a goodie. Okay, again, we don't have time to do, we have 10 minutes left. We spend weeks on internet governance. This is that underground kind of policy work that I was talking about, kind of policy in design. What's important to understand, we talked about ICANN, IETF, IRTF, these are all organizations, I think this graphic's probably one of the best ones, that this is how the internet itself is actually governed, okay? Through these multi-stakeholder organizations, some of which are listed here, you can look them up online. One of the things I have my students do is look them up and then figure out how accessible are they to participate in. And many of them, you guys could go to the meetings. They're open, right? Or you can send in a comment. This is truly like a crowdsourcing, organic operation that's been running the internet since its inception, growing, right? And most people in Washington who deal in the overt policy process have no idea this is going on, right? No idea. All the companies are participating in these conversations. So you have civil society, internet users, private sector, governments, mostly not ours, national, international organizations, research, academic, technical communities. And I shouldn't say that too strongly. Some are. State Department leads delegations of companies too and does some coordination, so they're involved. A story for another time, but a guy named Bobby Flame for the FBI started going to some of these meetings years ago and has convinced them to start having law enforcement working groups in some of these meetings and has pulled people in for that perspective. But for the purposes of this, I just want you to be aware that this universe exists out there. This is where the ongoing, again, discussion about the design and functionality of the internet is going on. And there's opportunities to participate. And if we're gonna really understand and make change in cyber policy, we need to get in at this level, okay? This is like years to discuss. That was 5 minutes. I hope that's helpful as a lead. Okay. I wanna leave a couple minutes for other questions. I promised you, when we started, a list of other resources. So if this has got you interested, and you're like, okay, where else can I go to sort of get my mind around some of these things? I wanted to offer up some of these resources that I use pretty regularly. Politico has a morning cybersecurity report, comes out at 10 a.m. in your email. It's awesome, right? So I highly recommend that. Washington Post has CyberWire. For those of you who are not Lawful readers, they increasingly have cyber content there, and it is thoughtful and issue specific. There's an incredible resource, and I think someone here works FOIA. Somebody works FOIA issues. So there's something called the National Security Archive at GW, and they FOIA a lot of primary source documents from government, and they have a subcomponent called the Cyber Vault. So if you're looking, you're like, I need to find this document. I want to know some of these primary source spots. I want to go, not just read PPD 41, but read some of the back and forth that went into the creation of that document. Start at the Cyber Vault at GW. I work with Mike Martell there. It's not super well organized, right? So that's something we're working on. It's done by librarians and data science people, so the content is exceptional. The interface can be a little challenging. Don't let it deter you. If there's something in there you need or want, I can connect you with Mike. We, with Mike, are working on a project to kind of take that very scrappy model I showed you and then overlay it on some of their data and other data so it's easier to find, right? You can kind of orient yourself to it. This guy Max Meets has a blog and has cyber reference materials on there. And then, as I said, that's my line for my project, right? So we're doing a multi-university and multi-organizational project to try and map a lot of this stuff graphically and then link that back to those primary source documents so users have an easier way to kind of pull the history and do the research by issue, is my hope, on who the players are and kind of what the history is in each of these areas. All right? We have 7 minutes. I have a discussion question next, but before, let me just stop there. If there's questions, we can spend the balance of the time. Again, we just did a semester in 85 minutes. But what questions do you have, or what are you thinking based on this? Any other questions before you get?
Do you think in the full class you're going to go more in depth on the international side of things? Because I know that things like even like EU rules that come out that affect how corporations work and then how that all ties together.
Yeah. So it's a challenge for us and something I've been struggling with here. We have the School of International Service also literally right next door to me, and so classes, so we're working together to figure out how to bring those things together. It's already too much to try and do all of this in a semester, right? So we're trying to work with them to figure out how to structure our curriculum so our students get from them and get from us, and we can start to contextualize all that together.
Cool.
Yeah, it's a challenge though.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an
I'm
ongoing
sure.
challenge. What other questions? I'm gonna put up a discussion question. Will you talk to me? Yes.
You made a comment about, you know, how there's, your online bank, you use Gmail, and there's access to that for law enforcement through, you said enterprise controlled access. What does that mean, enterprise controlled access?
Yep.
Company, how does that functionally work?
Absolutely. So let me start by saying I will not give you the technical answer to that, right? And I can point you to resources that explain how, essentially, there's different ways to implement encryption, okay? So there are ways to do it that's what's called end-to-end encryption, where there's no third-party access. So it's me and you, and that's it, right? It's what WhatsApp promises, but turns out they've got problems too, okay? But there are other ways to implement encryption, right? So your Gmail's encrypted when it's going back and forth, but when it's sitting on the Google servers, there's a set of keys back there, right? That they can think about it like admin access. So my laptop, right, whether it's owned by the consulting firm or the university, it is secured by encryption, but there's an admin access point, right? That's secured by a password, a set of keys, right? So Gmail works the same way. Essentially, think of it as like this admin access by Google, right? And what's really interesting to me is, and kind of commensurate with the law enforcement warrant thing, is this idea of financial services. So New York State, not to go down this whole road, but essentially somebody created a texting app that bankers were using to communicate with each other as trades were being made. And it was end-to-end encrypted. And the financial oversight entity in the state of New York said, you can't do that, right? Because you're a regulated industry, and should something go wrong and we think there's fraud or any kind of abuse, we need to be able to access all of that, right? So they made them back off and said that those tools must have admin access should a regulator need to get in. It's the same thing we're sort of saying in a broader context. And one more thing, because I always like to talk about it because I can, when we talk about lawful access, people say, well, the bad guys will always find a way, right? They'll create a way to communicate that is walled off, right? Person to person, end to end. And what I say to that is, if only the bad guys, the smart bad guys, because there's a lot of not smart bad guys, we count on that in law enforcement, okay? If only the smart bad guys were doing that, then we could use the limited resources law enforcement and the intelligence community have to try and get in and hack in and do that. We're in a situation now where victims of crime are in that situation by default, right? So if I was a victim of a crime, right, law enforcement could not get into my island, right? So they're not just trying to get into bad guys' information, they're trying to look at victims' information too. And it might be something also as simple as distracted driving, right? So we have a case and we want to know if someone was texting while they were driving, if there was homicide, for example. But we can't get in if that person's not alive, right? So there's a lot of other contexts that's important to consider. Other questions? Thoughts before we wrap? You guys are so quiet. You were like fired up there for a second and now like, yes!
Honestly, one of the other interesting aspects for me is how much government is moving to the cloud via Azure, AWS.
Yes.
Pick it.
Yep.
In all the context of everything you just said.
Incredible.
And, you know, some of it they're doing on the military side, you know, they'll do a mil cloud.
Yep.
You know, you just kind of wonder, well, what's all the other controls going around that they're addressing some of the things that you bring up.
100%. If you sit in any department or agency, you can still think, oh, it doesn't apply to me. At a minimum, right? Folks are working IT. Like, for your department or agency, where's your data sit? Right? Where's Microsoft in your agency? Everywhere, right? Everyone's everywhere. The FBI uses iPhones, which I always think is ironic and hilarious, right? I mean, there's a procurement aspect to all of this for the government, if for no other reason, right? If for no other reason a department thinks, well, fiber is not my problem, which it is for everybody. From a procurement perspective, it is everybody's problem. We're going to the cloud, we're buying laptops and phones for our employees. It's all relevant to these conversations. Yeah.
And for relation, not even, well, Congress may not be doing much in this area. One area that you do start having to be a problem is if it becomes an issue and your agency gets rated less than well, that becomes a pressure point that they might have to press the bills, but they'll call your CIO up to the bill.
Exactly.
And say, explain to me why you got an F this year.
Yep.
Okay, well, you got a C for next year, that's great, well, what are you doing to move it up?
Yep, yep. They like to complain about it, right? The constructive is a little still falling a little bit behind. Yes, ma'am?
You said something earlier that is so true. You said that everything is, I don't know if it's the money driven. Profit, that's the term you use.
Yeah.
Profit driven. And after listening to you, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, okay, when all this started, now I need LifeLock, I need this. I need this, I need that. So out of my check every month, I'm probably gonna dump out a good 500 to protect myself against all of these things, and it's.
So let me say this, okay? Let me leave you with this, a couple thoughts. First of all, I say this all, and hopefully, I say this all because hopefully to orient you to the policy process, but in terms of risk in the cyberspace, right? Just to be totally clear, for those of you who are now like, oh boy, like I can't online bank, LifeLock. Like, I think that what's important to understand is sort of we accept risk in lots of parts of our lives, right? Driving is the most dangerous thing y'all are gonna do. Right?
That's not,
What's that?
flying safe.
Flying safe or
Flying safe.
driving's not safe, right? We do lots of things for convenience, like driving, that are quite dangerous, right? I don't think everyone needs LifeLock, right? And I don't think you should stop online banking. But I think we need to have an awareness of the trade-offs we're making. And when people argue that's a trade-off that's gone too far, we need to think about all the trade-offs we're making, right? I believe Gmail's safe enough, I use it, right? I believe online banking is safe enough, and I use it. But I also live with an awareness, right, of what that could mean. So I don't mean to say, right, spend your life, and I don't believe in LifeLock in particular. And also beware of the people who, some of the companies send out cyber alerts right before they release a new product, right? They're like, oh, a big threat. Oh, new product, right? So you gotta be careful on that end too. But yeah, it's very interesting. Anyway, so I don't wanna leave you thinking, I just think we have to think about risk as a relative thing, and we have to think sensibly about it. And if you took nothing else away, hopefully that you're starting to think about who's involved in that conversation. And if you see conversations going on that only have one piece of these stakeholders, be concerned, right? It's not gonna be productive and it's not gonna move the ball forward. Okay, one more question I have to let you know.
It may also have to do with cyber or maybe not, but you were saying that driving is the most, like I don't know who has Allstate, and then they ask you to download the app so they can see how you're driving to save money.
Yeah.
It's at your own risk. I will not do it because sometimes my brake is really hard. So I don't want them to know that.
Right, we all have to set limits somehow, right? Exactly. Our health insurance wants access to our IoT and body. Anyway, thank you so much for being here. So I am doing this mapping project for those of you who work in this space who want to stay involved. We love to hear from folks working on the ground, how this is playing out. My email is sasha@american.edu. I'd love to stay in touch. And if you need help with your next classroom or anything else, I'll be around for this. Thank you guys. Have a great day. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. We're down.
You want the representative.
Right.
You want to teach them.
That's very different.
Right, Meg? Really, all the rest of your.
Oh, the rest of them, okay, yeah.
Like we're 4, still 3, and then we're 7, 8, 9.
Oh, so literally.
Okay, great.
You guys.
Good luck with that.
All are.
Okay, good. So it's perfect that we're here together. Oh, my goodness. And we think of this project. We're going to get into detail. And then I can talk to you, Dorian. Okay. Yeah, we do that too. I'm a Kerwin board. Program manager. Yes. Yes. Victor just being the same group, now he's on the other side of the house. Yes. Yes, he's so cool. So next week, I'll email and then I can get it.
Sandra.
Where's your office?
Let's go.
It was nice. That's what I did, change my mind.
But exactly what we're here.
I